In October 1972, a small military charter plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team took off from Montevideo, heading towards Santiago, Chile. The flight was supposed to be short and routine, crossing the Andes Mountains before landing later that afternoon. On board were young athletes, friends, and crew members excited for the match they were about to play. None of them imagined that within hours they would become part of one of the most astonishing survival stories in modern history. As the aircraft approached the Andes, the weather began to change. Thick clouds rolled across the mountains, and powerful winds pushed the small plane off its expected path. Visibility dropped, and the pilots believed they had already passed the highest peaks. They were wrong. Suddenly, through the clouds, massive walls of rock and ice appeared directly ahead. The plane was flying too low and too close to the mountains. The pilots tried desperately to climb, but it was too late. The aircraft struck a ridge of the Andes at high speed. The impact tore away parts of the plane, including the wings and tail. The remaining fuselage slid down the snowy slope like a sled before coming to a violent stop in a remote valley surrounded by towering mountains. The crash was devastating. Some passengers died instantly, but others miraculously survived. When the survivors began to regain consciousness, they looked around and realized the true scale of the disaster. The landscape was endless snow and ice. The peaks around them rose thousands of meters into the sky. There were no roads, no villages, no sign of life anywhere. They were completely alone in one of the most remote regions on Earth. At first, the survivors believed rescue teams would arrive quickly. Planes had flight plans. Authorities would know roughly where they had been flying. It seemed only a matter of time before search aircraft spotted the wreckage against the white snow. But hours turned into days. The survivors used pieces of the broken fuselage as shelter from the brutal mountain wind. Temperatures dropped far below freezing every night. They gathered the small amount of food they could find among the wreckage, a few chocolate bars, some wine, and small snacks. They rationed everything carefully, expecting rescue at any moment. Meanwhile, search planes flew overhead across the Andes, scanning the mountains for any sign of the missing aircraft. But the white fuselage blended almost perfectly into the snow-covered landscape. From the air, it was nearly invisible. After several days, the food supply ran out. Hunger began to set in. The survivors were weak, injured, and freezing, yet they continued to wait. Each day they scanned the sky for aircraft. Each day the sky remained empty.
Then disaster struck again. One night, while most of the group was sleeping inside the fuselage, a massive avalanche roared down the mountain. Tons of snow slammed into the wreckage and buried it completely. Several survivors were trapped under the snow. It took hours for the others to dig them out. The avalanche made their situation even more desperate. They realized something terrifying. If they did nothing, they would slowly die in the mountains. Weeks passed. The outside world eventually assumed that everyone on board the missing plane had died in the crash. The search effort was officially called off. But in the frozen valley of the Andes, a small group of survivors was still alive. With almost no resources and surrounded by towering mountains, they began making an extraordinary decision. If rescue was not coming, they would have to rescue themselves. The problem was the Andes Mountains themselves. The peaks around them were enormous. Many were over 4,000 meters high. The air was thin, and the slopes were covered in deep snow and ice. Climbing out seemed almost impossible. Still, several survivors began preparing for an expedition. They improvised clothing and equipment from materials inside the wreckage. Pieces of seat fabric became insulation. Metal from the aircraft was shaped into tools. Everything they used came from the remains of the plane. Finally, after weeks trapped in the mountains, two of the strongest survivors began the journey. They left the crash site behind and started climbing into the unknown. The climb was brutal. Every step through the deep snow required enormous effort. The cold wind cut through their clothing. At night, they slept in makeshift shelters built from snow. For days, they crossed ridges, glaciers, and frozen valleys. At one point, they reached the top of a massive peak and saw an endless ocean of mountains stretching in every direction. It seemed civilization might be hundreds of kilometers away. Still, they continued walking. They had no maps, no real equipment, and no guarantee they were heading the right direction. But turning back meant certain death. After about 10 days of traveling through the mountains, something incredible happened. In the distance, far below the snow line, they saw green valleys and running water. It was the first sign of life they had seen in months. Eventually, they spotted a man on horseback across a river. The survivors tried shouting, but the roaring water drowned out their voices. Instead, they wrote a message on a piece of paper and attached it to a rock, throwing it across the river to the man. The message explained everything: a plane crash in the mountains and survivors still waiting for rescue. The horseman immediately rode to get help. Soon, authorities organized a rescue mission. Helicopters flew deep into the Andes and located the crash site. Against all expectations, 16 people were still alive after more than 2 months trapped in the frozen mountains. One by one, the survivors were lifted into the helicopters and flown to safety. Their story shocked the world. What they endured in the Andes became one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever recorded. Surrounded by freezing temperatures, endless snow, and towering mountains, they refused to give up. Their determination to survive, even in the most impossible conditions, proved something remarkable about human resilience. Sometimes the difference between life and death is the decision to keep going one more day.